If this was a total misunderstanding, I didn't know it was your cruiser.
Guess even the law isn't safe from HOA rules, huh?
The morning the neighborhood turned into a parking war zone started deceptively calm, with a soft breeze drifting across Maple Creek and the faint smell of cut grass in the air. But beneath that quiet suburban veneer, the HOA president, a power-hungry perfectionist named Linda Harrington, had already set a trap that would ignite chaos. For months, she had been tightening her grip on the community, waving around bylaws like Holy Scripture and scribbling violation notices for the smallest infractions, a mailbox slightly tilted, a flower bed with one weed showing, a trash can visible for more than 12 minutes after pickup. Residents had grumbled, but no one had dared challenge her authority openly, not after seeing neighbors fined for trivialities or publicly shamed at meetings. What she didn't know was that her thirst for control was about to backfire in the most humiliating way possible. Understand why the moment hit like a thunderclap. You have to know the kind of person Linda was and the kind of neighborhood Maple Creek used to be. Most of us moved here for the promise of peaceful evenings, friendly waves from neighbors, and a little slice of safety where kids could ride bikes without worry. I'm Nate Williams, 47, a single dad who works long hours at a fabrication shop, and Maple Creek was my sanctuary. My blue pickup might not be shiny, but it's reliable, and the dents in its side panel tell stories of camping trips with my son, not carelessness. To me and the others, our cars weren't just vehicles. They were lifelines for work, school runs, and weekend fishing at Lake Jackson. Linda, however, viewed every driveway and curb like pieces on a chessboard she controlled. Her house was the biggest on the street, manicured to the point of sterility, with security cameras pointing in every direction and perfectly trimmed hedges forming rigid walls of green. She strutted around in designer shoes that didn't quite fit our cracked sidewalks, a tablet in hand loaded with the HOA's digital violation tracker, and a permanent smirk that suggested she thought herself the savior of Maple Creek's property values. It wasn't enough for her to enforce rules fairly. She needed to flaunt her power. Each meeting became a stage for her speeches about standards and order, while whispers spread about her own double-parked SUV that somehow never made her lists. The tension had been simmering since spring when Linda proposed Operation Compliance, a sweeping crackdown that would, in her words, restore Maple Creek's prestige. She passed a new resolution authorizing immediate towing of any non-compliant vehicles, cars parked slightly over the sidewalk line, trucks without HOA-approved parking permits. Even visitors' vehicles lingering past 11 p.m. Residents begged for leniency, pointing out that Maple Creek was a working-class neighborhood with night shift nurses, delivery drivers, and parents juggling unpredictable schedules. But Linda was deaf to reason. She declared that beginning Friday morning, tow trucks would patrol the neighborhood and remove offenders without warning. To make her point, she hired a local towing company to sweep every street, promising them bonuses for quick action. That Friday dawned deceptively pretty, sunlight bouncing off windshields and birds chirping like the world was normal. But by 8 a.m., the rumble of diesel engines shattered the calm. Two massive tow rigs rolled in, their yellow hazard lights spinning like beacons of doom. Neighbors peered from windows as hooks clanked onto bumpers and winches groaned. Within the first hour, a half-dozen cars were gone. Sam's aging Honda, Marisol's work van, even a teenager's little red coupe parked momentarily by a friend's house. Shock turned to outrage, but Linda watched from her porch with arms folded and sunglasses glinting, as if savoring her victory. She believed she had finally stamped her authority on Maple Creek, proving no one was untouchable. What she couldn't see, what would unravel her carefully crafted reign, was the black and white cruiser parked near the community playground, partially hidden by trees. Deputy Sheriff Collins often stopped there after overnight shifts, grabbing a quick nap before heading to court appearances. His cruiser bore county plates and an official seal, but from the angle and distance, to an overzealous tow operator, it looked like any other unpermitted vehicle. As residents whispered and texted furiously, one of the tow drivers eyed the cruiser, glanced at his bonus sheet, and began reversing toward it. The sound of the winch cable rattling against metal echoed down the street like a starting gun for a race Linda didn't know she was about to lose. The hook clipped onto the bumper with a final metallic click. a sound that would soon turn Maple Creek's tyrant queen into the neighborhood's biggest joke. It'd be why the time someone shouted that the sheriff's cruiser was being lifted, half the street had gathered. Phones came out, recording every second. A ripple of laughter mixed with gasps swept through the crowd as the unmistakable emblem of county law enforcement rose off the asphalt. Linda, oblivious at first, continued sipping her herbal tea on the porch steps. When she finally turned her head and saw the cruiser swinging on the tow rig, her sunglasses slipped slightly down her nose, and for the first time in months, her smirk vanished. The crowd sensed it, the shift in power, the crack in her armor. And though no one dared speak above a murmur yet, the air itself seemed to hum with the promise that the Queen's crown was about to tumble. Spectacularly, Linda's momentary lapse of control rippled through Maple Creek like a shockwave as the tow rig rumbled down the street carrying the sheriff's cruiser, its hazard lights flickering like an unintentional warning beacon of the storm about to come. The neighbors, once silent under Linda's rule, began to trade glances that contained equal parts amusement and disbelief, their whispers turning to murmurs that grew louder with every block the truck traveled. Even those who had supported her strict policies felt the ground shifting under their feet, realizing that if the sheriff's vehicle could be mistaken for a violation, none of their cars were safe. Linda, frozen on her porch for a heartbeat too long, finally spun on her heel and hurried inside, slamming her door as if retreating could undo what had just happened. The street, however, was alive with an energy it hadn't known in years, and phones buzzed as videos of the incident spread beyond the neighborhood within minutes. By noon, half of Maple Creek had seen the clip, and the other half was talking about it. Nate, who had quietly endured Linda's fines for his slightly dented pickup and his late-night work schedule, felt something stir inside him, a mix of vindication and resolve. For months, he had watched neighbors pay up, repaint shutters, and park their cars blocks away just to avoid Linda's wrath. Now, with the sheriff's cruiser swinging like a trophy on a tow hook, the narrative had changed. By early afternoon, cars that had been tucked neatly away in garages began reappearing in driveways and along the curbs, as if the neighborhood collectively decided to test Linda's power. The crack in her authority widened when a few brave residents parked their trucks slightly over the sidewalk line, a silent protest that dared her to act. The tow trucks, still roaming the streets, hesitated now, the operators murmuring to each other as they replayed the scene of hauling off a law enforcement vehicle. Word of the cruiser's impoundment reached the sheriff's department. Before Linda could mount any kind of damage control, Deputy Collins, woken abruptly from his brief rest by a call from dispatch, listened in stunned silence as he was informed his cruiser had been towed from Maple Creek. He knew Linda by reputation. The department had fielded minor complaints from residents about her heavy-handedness, but this was different. A government vehicle, critical equipment, and an active deputy's credentials were now sitting in a tow yard miles away, and protocol dictated that a report be filed and an investigation launched. Collins's embarrassment quickly hardened into anger as he imagined the teasing he'd endure back at the station and the paperwork mountain this blunder would create. The department brass, concerned about liability and public perception, demanded answers, which meant Maple Creek and its queen of compliance were about to receive the full glare of official scrutiny. By mid-afternoon, social media posts tagged the county sheriff's office and local news outlets. Hashtags mocking Maple Creek's Operation Compliance began trending in the local feed. Even residents who had previously kept their distance from HOA drama found themselves grinning at memes showing Linda's face superimposed on a tow truck or captions reading, "Standards so high. Even the law isn't safe." Linda tried to regain control by issuing a stern email blast, insisting that the towing of the sheriff's cruiser was a regrettable misunderstanding, and doubling down on her message about community standards. But the email only fueled the fire. Screenshots of her statement, filled with corporate jargon and deflection, were shared with sarcastic commentary, and residents began replying all with jokes or pointed questions about her own parking habits. What had once been a climate of fear now felt like a carnival, and Linda's once commanding presence had shrunk to the butt of a joke. As evening settled over Maple Creek, the tow trucks disappeared, perhaps under quiet orders to avoid further damage, leaving behind a neighborhood littered with lingering resentment and simmering excitement. Small groups of neighbors gathered in driveways and on porches, recounting the day's events with laughter that bordered on giddy relief. Nate stood by his pickup, nursing a beer as his son kicked a ball in the yard, and for the first time in months, he felt the weight of Linda's constant surveillance lift. Bob and Marisol joined him, their voices hushed at first but growing louder as they discussed what might happen next. They spoke of years of fines, of Linda's intimidation tactics, and of the countless times they had wished for someone to stand up to her. Now, the sheriff's department had unintentionally done it for them. And the question wasn't whether Linda would face consequences. It was how severe they would be. The next morning, a county sheriff's SUV, this one unmistakably driven by a senior officer, rolled slowly into Maple Creek. The sight sent children running to windows and neighbors peeking through curtains. The vehicle stopped directly in front of Linda's pristine lawn, and the officer stepped out, his uniform crisp and his expression unreadable. He didn't knock immediately. He stood for a moment, surveying the spotless hedges, the perfectly edged walkway, and the camera that swiveled mechanically toward him. When he finally did approach the door, the knock echoed down the street like a drumbeat announcing a reckoning. Though the words exchanged inside weren't audible, the image of Linda standing on her porch, nodding stiffly and clutching her tablet like a shield, was enough to confirm what everyone suspected. The sheriff's department wasn't letting this slide. The Queen of Maple Creek had overplayed her hand, and the first pieces of her carefully arranged kingdom were beginning to topple. The visit from the sheriff's department sent ripples of anticipation through Maple Creek. And for the first time in years, Linda Harrington's carefully cultivated aura of authority seemed fragile. Neighbors who once ducked their heads and hurried past her porch now lingered outside in quiet groups, their conversations charged with a mixture of curiosity and delight. The sheriff's cruiser sat conspicuously in her driveway for nearly an hour before rolling away, leaving behind a neighborhood that was suddenly alive with speculation. Nobody knew exactly what was said inside Linda's spotless living room, but the stiff way she stood at her mailbox afterward, shoulders tight and eyes darting nervously, spoke volumes. Her tablet was nowhere in sight, and for the rest of that day, no violation notices appeared on windshields or front doors. Instead, Maple Creek seemed to breathe for the first time in months. The oppressive weight of Linda's rule temporarily lifted by afternoon. The story had spread beyond their quiet suburb. A local news van cruised slowly past the playground, its camera discreetly filming B-roll footage of Maple Creek's idyllic streets. Residents began receiving texts from friends in other neighborhoods, screenshots of headlines about an HOA towing a sheriff's vehicle, and interviews with the county spokesperson confirming that an investigation into the HOA's procedural overreach was underway. Social media pages that Linda had used to post stern reminders about lawn care and parking guidelines were now flooded with sarcastic comments and memes. One image showing a tow truck dragging a cruiser had been edited to add Linda's name under a caption reading, "No car above the law." The narrative had slipped completely out of her control. Nate watched the developments unfold with cautious satisfaction. He had no desire to see Maple Creek descend into chaos, but he couldn't help savoring the irony. For years, Linda had wielded the HOA's power like a weapon, justifying every petty fine with lofty rhetoric about preserving community integrity. Yet now, the very rules she had used to intimidate her neighbors had exposed her own recklessness. Conversations among residents became more candid, stories spilling out about her long history of selective enforcement and favoritism. Sam recalled the time Linda had ignored her friend's illegally parked SUV during a party but fined him for leaving his work truck near the curb. Marisol quietly admitted that Linda had once threatened her with eviction over a planter that didn't match the neighborhood's color palette. Each recollection was another brick pulled from the crumbling foundation of Linda's authority. The HOA board members, long cowed by Linda's domineering presence, began to waver. At an impromptu gathering on Saturday evening, whispers of a no-confidence vote circulated. Even some of Linda's staunchest allies, those who had benefited from her favoritism or feared her reprisals, started to distance themselves. The realization spread that aligning with her might now carry more risk than reward. The sheriff's department's interest in the matter meant there could be legal repercussions for improper towing orders, especially involving a government vehicle. insurance liabilities, potential fines, and the possibility of lawsuits loomed over the HOA like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. On Sunday morning, Nate took his usual walk around the block with his son, noticing subtle changes in the atmosphere. Lawns that had once been meticulously pruned out of fear now showed hints of individuality. A new bird feeder here, a slightly unconventional flower arrangement there. Even small acts of personal expression felt revolutionary. Several neighbors greeted him with smiles instead of wary glances. They no longer lowered their voices when discussing the HOA's excesses, and one elderly couple even laughed openly about Linda's downfall, something unimaginable just days before. The shift was palpable, like the first breath after a long-held silence. By Monday, Maple Creek felt almost festive. Cars lined the streets freely, their owners emboldened by Linda's weakened grip. A group of teens decorated a cardboard cutout of a tow truck with streamers and parked it near the playground as a joke. Parents snapped pictures, and the image quickly joined the growing library of online jokes about the incident. Yet beneath the laughter, Nate sensed a deeper current. The recognition that bullies lose their power the moment people stop complying out of fear. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky blushed with streaks of orange, he sat on his porch reflecting on the lesson unfolding around him. Linda had spent years building a facade of absolute control. But one careless overreach, a tow hook snapping onto the wrong bumper, had shattered it. Still, Linda was not the kind of person to retreat quietly. Though humiliated, she began plotting ways to salvage her reputation. Rumors swirled that she had called an emergency HOA board meeting for Wednesday night, intending to reassert her dominance and frame the towing debacle as a minor mishap blown out of proportion. But the neighbors were no longer the same intimidated audience they once were. Screenshots of the news coverage circulated with snarky captions, and several residents quietly coordinated to attend the meeting en masse, determined to challenge her narrative. They compared notes on her past hypocrisies and agreed that this time, she would not be allowed to spin the story in her favor. The stage was set for a confrontation that promised to be far more consequential than any HOA gathering Maple Creek had ever seen. As darkness settled over the neighborhood that night, porch lights flickered on, illuminating small clusters of residents sharing quiet conversations about the coming showdown. The once isolated pockets of frustration had coalesced into a unified front. Even the children seemed to sense the shift, their laughter ringing freer as they rode their bikes along streets that no longer felt like the domain of an overbearing ruler. Nate watched his son chase fireflies in the warm twilight and felt a swell of pride mixed with anticipation. The Queen of Maple Creek had ruled unchallenged for too long, but her throne was wobbling, and the community was ready to give it the final push. Wednesday evening arrived with a heavy stillness, as if even the air was aware that Maple Creek stood on the edge of a turning point. The community center's parking lot, once half empty during typical HOA meetings, overflowed with vehicles lined up along the curb and spilling onto the grass. Neighbors who had previously avoided gatherings to escape Linda's scolding emails now showed up wearing quiet determination on their faces, some clutching folded copies of the HOA bylaws they had dusted off for the first time. The interior of the meeting hall buzzed with low conversation, the smell of coffee and fresh pastries filling the space like a strange sign of celebration rather than formality. Nate arrived early and took a seat near the back, noting how different the atmosphere felt. Lighter, freer, yet charged with expectation. Even Linda's most loyal supporters avoided eye contact, fiddling with phones or fanning themselves with agendas. When Linda finally entered, she wore her usual polished armor, a crisp blazer and sharp heels, but the confident rhythm of her steps was missing. The room's chatter dimmed, but no one lowered their heads or shifted nervously as they once had. She moved to the front of the room, her tablet clutched tightly, but her fingers twitched against its case, betraying the cracks in her composure. As the meeting began, she attempted to steer the narrative toward technicalities, reading aloud procedural language about towing policies and insisting that unfortunate miscommunications had led to the sheriff's cruiser being removed. But the faces staring back at her were no longer passive. As she scrolled through her notes and avoided lingering on the words sheriff or unregistered, a subtle rustle passed through the room, a shared understanding. that the era of unquestioned compliance was over. The board members themselves looked uneasy, two of them exchanging glances before clearing their throats and muttering about liability insurance and reputational damage. The community treasurer, a usually silent figure, tapped her pen on the table and made a pointed remark about transparency and consistency, while another board member asked bluntly whether Linda had verified the towing orders against county regulations before giving the green light. Linda's answers grew vaguer, her voice losing the confident cadence it once held. Nate watched the shift unfold like a slow-motion collapse. The same neighbors who had once cowered now sat taller in their chairs, emboldened by the knowledge that their collective voice carried more weight than Linda's threats. When the murmured suggestion of a no-confidence vote rippled across the room, it gathered momentum quickly, spreading like fire through dry grass. The vote was swift and almost anticlimactic in its finality. Hands rose, one after another, including several that had once propped up Linda's authority. When the count was announced, a wave of relieved laughter and scattered applause rolled through the room, breaking months of tension in an instant. Linda stood frozen, her expression flickering between disbelief and fury, but the room had already moved on from her. The board announced that towing operations would be suspended pending a full review of policies, and a temporary president, an even-tempered neighbor named Carla, was appointed to oversee community affairs until a formal election could be held. Carla promised fairness and transparency, words Maple Creek had not heard from the HOA's leadership in a long time. Outside, under the glow of streetlights, neighbors lingered as if savoring their newfound freedom. They exchanged phone numbers, shared stories, and even laughed at their own past fears, the ridiculousness of measuring hedge heights and panicking over misplaced recycling bins suddenly clear in the fresh air of change. Nate stood with Bob and Marisol, watching children play tag under the oaks, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not gloating, but a quiet triumph in seeing justice served and community spirit restored. The sheriff's department had issued a formal statement earlier that day, confirming that the towing company was cleared of wrongdoing due to Linda's explicit instructions and noting that the HOA would be held responsible for all costs. It was a polite but firm acknowledgement that rules had limits. Even in a neighborhood obsessed with them. By the weekend, Maple Creek felt transformed. Driveways brimmed with cars again, not recklessly but without the shadow of fear. Residents decorated porches with planters that had once been deemed non-compliant, and children drew chalk art on sidewalks without anxious glances for Linda's tablet. Nate repaired the dent on his pickup at his own pace, unconcerned about her sharp-eyed inspections. Linda's house, once the nerve center of control, stood oddly silent. Curtains stayed drawn, and her SUV remained parked neatly, as though she were hoping invisibility might erase the humiliation. The neighborhood had moved on without her. As autumn crept in, Maple Creek found a rhythm that was both familiar and new. Saturday barbecues returned. Laughter floated freely across lawns, and neighbors borrowed tools or shared baked goods without suspicion. The memory of the sheriff's cruiser swinging from the tow rig became a story retold with chuckles at every gathering, a reminder of the day power shifted back to the people it was meant to serve. For Nate, the lesson was simple but profound. Control is an illusion sustained only as long as others believe in it. The sheriff's impounded vehicle had not merely exposed Linda's hypocrisy. It had revealed the strength of a community that had been there all along, waiting for a moment to stand together. And as he watched his son chase falling leaves along the street, Nate understood that Maple Creek had regained something more valuable than any perfectly parked car. It had reclaimed its peace.